We have been talking about Annie being here for the whole year, and she says that she got connected with poetry when she went to her first visit to an Oregon old-growth forest, which, and I can really relate to that. After that, she got an MFA in poetry from Vermont College and published her poetry collection, which is Iron String by Airlie Press. She's taught at Boston College as a poet in the schools and currently teaches workshops for Portland Mountain writers. Annie's poetry has been read by Garrison Keillor on the Writer's Almanac and chosen by Naomi Shaibnai to be placed in Ireland's Galway University Hospitals as part of their Poems for Patients project. She lives in a small green corner, she says, of Portland. Would you join me in welcoming our poet tonight, Annie Lighthart? Annie,
I fully believe that poetry is not a elite, highbrow kind of thing with a frill. So if you have a broadside, you can use it as a fan. Thank you for coming. This is one of my favorite poetry places. When I was driving over here tonight, I realized that coming here to the Pond House is like a homecoming. I've been coming to this series for a while now. I started coming in spring of 2008 to hear Kate Gray read, and I've been coming back ever since. I love being here in all seasons to hear poetry. And one of my favorite things to do is to sit by the pondside window, right about there, especially when it stays light out like tonight, and to imagine that I live here. I like to imagine where I'd put the couch, which is right there, and the bookcases, to right and left of the fireplace. I have it nicely furnished. And I also love to look over at the library, which is my beloved local library. And when it gets dark out, you can see the lights and the books. And I love to sit and look over there and have poetry at the same time. It's a feast. So thank you, Tom, and the Poetry Committee and the Letting Library in Milwaukie for this chance to read and for sharing this wonderful house. And thank you all for coming and braving the heat. One of the things I've always admired about this poetry series is that it runs a little longer, and it gives you the chance to go deeper into a poet's work and voice. Or I should say, I always thought it was a wonderful thing until I got up here just now. It makes me sweat a little bit now. And when I told my father I was giving a longer reading, he reassured me that it would fly by. But he said not to be alarmed if anyone closed their eyes for a little while. Because, he's a biologist, I should say. He's a brand new fan of poetry. But he swore to me that you can hear poetry better if you close your eyes. And I was a little suspicious of his wisdom because my father has perfected the art of falling asleep anywhere at the drop of a hat, and just so beautifully and straight up and elegantly that you feel you've done him a service by lulling him to sleep. So he has never admitted to being asleep. He calls it resting his eyes. So if you feel the need to rest your eyes tonight, that's okay. I thought I'd start off with a poem about goodness, because this reading is full of thanks for this community and all the good work it does. It's called A Great Wild Goodness. One morning, I was looking out the window when a great wild goodness came over me. I wanted to be kind to everything. I promised not to kill the big spider on the wall. In the cold, I took the dog for the long walk she'd been wanting. I fetched a trash can lid for an ornery neighbor and did not just then add a single adjective to his name. I went back inside to the laundry and dishes with a clean heart such as I have never had. Before dinner, the wild goodness shouted, "Too tame, too tame." So I went outside without my coat and shouted poems up to the stars until my children came home with their small, warm hands. Then we ate bread in the kitchen, unafraid to be happy. The stars in wild darkness were right over our heads. This winter, I thought I would try to write a poem in an official poetic form, kind of like a grown-up poet. And I realized it was sort of like taking on an exercise program, some kind of poetic calisthenics. And it was very humbling because it turns out I don't have the muscle or the stamina for forms like the villanelle or the sestina. And I took refuge in the ode. I was especially drawn to the ode when I learned that there's a kind of ode called an irregular. And being an oddball myself, this really felt like there was hope in it. So the basic definition of an ode that inspired me is that it's a poem spoken to a person or thing not present. And I realized immediately that the thing not present in my life is sleep. Sleep hasn't been present for years. Although I mentioned that my father is a champion sleeper, I missed out on that beautiful gift. If it was a gene, I didn't get it. So instead of sleeping, I write about it a lot, with great longing. So this is an ode, a very irregular ode. It's called To Sleep. I bless you, sleep. I count you among all the other good things I count, waiting in comfortable, familiar darkness for you to arrive. I count on you, thief to whom I leave open all my belongings, for whom I unlock my door. I count you again, sleep, beautiful currency, you the coin that closes eyes and then slides off with ease. You who tips us over an unknown but wanted edge, giving an end to the day and all we have seen. And I count, switching from blessings to sheep, who must also sleep sometime, who must lie down in a pasture or shed and close their split, strange eyes. Each marked sheep, so exhausted from bleating and grazing, none can recall a wolf, nor even how to clear a low fence. Instead, they press together, waiting to be struck down as one, as if into the dark hold of a ship, leaving at midnight for a better place. Now the ship moves out with the tide, and the sails are unfurled. Now the ship is a cloud, a white flicker in the mind. Now it is you, sleep, and the horizon emptied of all number. For a while now, I've been preoccupied with a question. It's that kind of party quiz question you may have heard. If you could invite anyone in the world to an imaginary dinner party, whom would you ask, living or dead? And I've never answered this question well because it makes me nervous. I think as kind of a shy introvert, the idea of a high-stakes dinner party with important earthly and unearthly guests just kind of puts me over the edge. But I have given it some serious thought just in case. And this poem is my best shot at an answer. It's called Guest List. Only once, one afternoon, almost asleep on the couch, could I come up with the perfect guests for an imaginary dinner party, a mix of the living and dead, the deep and the shy, artfully combined with the swashbuckling talkers. It was such a list. Everyone would say yes, and we'd sit down in pairs maybe, or close little bunches, or maybe all together at the table while the candles burned low. Later, with a few out on the front step, what with our immediate kinship, the wine and warm night, I could ask them anything, historical, personal, and thus find out about the world and time. Our goodbyes would be fond and long. But just now, no one. I can't think of a soul I'd like over. Not one for whom I'd vacuum or shove laundry in the shower. You know who you are. Not one for whom I'd balance fine cheese on ridiculously small morsels of bread. Except you, person I just saw crossing the street. You who stopped to move a slug off the sidewalk with a little piece of paper you took from your coat. You I thought I would clean for. You I would like to meet. I should say, the first time I read this poem, a man came up to me afterward and asked me if I lived nearby. And he kind of looked at me funny. And I said, no, why? And he said, because I thought you saw me. And I still wasn't really with it. And I said, saw you? Still a little nervous. And he said, I thought you saw me move a slug off the sidewalk with a little piece of paper I took from my coat. And I thought, how cool is that? There really is a whole community of people all over moving slugs. It just gives me hope in humanity. So with that hope, I thought I would take a chance tonight and read 3 poems about seeing. This first one is about what might happen if humans look a long time at each other. The past couple years, I've found myself watching people, watching how often we meet each other's eyes, how long we really look at each other when we're talking, and sometimes it's not so long. And I thought, what would happen if we really saw each other and saw who we are? And on my bad days, I think maybe nothing. And on my good days, I think maybe everything. So this poem was written on a good day. It's called Vision. When we look long at one another, we soften, we relent, listen, might forgive. We allow for silence. And when we see each other, are known, and in that moment might change, though nothing has moved or been spoken. There are some who say the world cannot be unbroken, but suddenly we are in a free place, and the fields that extend from its center stretch for miles, as if out of the pupil and the iris of that momentary kingdom. And the second poem of seeing is called Fluency, and it came out of being very nearsighted. I've always thought of being nearsighted as a great disadvantage, and even more so now that I'm slightly over 40 and resisting getting bifocals. But recently I looked out the window and thought I saw a face among the flowers in the garden. And it turned out that being nearsighted was a lovely disadvantage to have. Fluency. The face among the flowers was not a face, but a flower that blurred the edge of comprehension until everything became a face. Everything had eyes. Everything had a mind with secret thoughts inside. And so the barn with its smudged windows stood aware of impatience and time. And the trowel with its small head in the dirt plotted how not to be found. And the old dog, who of course had her own old gray face, came to have another one and shifted and sighed on her rug while thinking about philosophy and the stillness of God. And then the depths of the afternoons she had passed alone crossed into my heart, and the ants climbing the table stopped and looked up, and I fell away blind into a softer knowing, as if into the flowers who took me as one of their own. This third poem of seeing is called The Sea Lion Tank, and it's dedicated to my little boy, Sam, who was 3 when he inspired this poem. I think children often see things so clearly. They're still so new to the world that their eyes are very open and unclouded. And to see the world as they do can be startling and painful because they give you a new light to try to live by. The Sea Lion Tank. Not split, but blessed into 2, the double world creatures, skin for water, skin for air, the rising power and swimming down. We watched so long, we disappeared from our eyes, left only handprints steaming on the glass, where the sea lion's great blue eye passed, where the wide scar on the throat pressed a whole length of sight. We stood under the worn path of arc and fall until the restless crowds had gone, until you said, "I am sad." And I, who said nothing, who held you while you cried, find that only when you are sleeping can I say what I mean. My little one, we choose for all things out of a terrible power. But to rise in the morning could be to lift your head from that sleep and love each salted star for what it may bring. Just as in the tank where the kings are held, the far sea is still awaking, the body remembers and believes. I've brought a new poem. It's a very tiny poem I wrote for my father, that man who can sleep so instantly and beautifully. My dad is 92 this year, and he says his gift for sleep was given to him as a young man, courtesy of the U.S. Army in World War II, and the many hours, the years he spent waiting in line for orders to come down. The poem's called 1943, which is the year he was drafted. He was taken out of school. He was 19. And the night before he was shipping out, he visited his parents. He didn't know where he was going or how long he'd be gone, and he was their only child. And he said he was talking with his parents when his father, who was full of fun, disappeared suddenly. And when he came back, he had squeezed himself into his old army uniform from World War I. And they took a photo side by side. And I've asked my dad a lot about that night, that moment of facing loss and another world war, which wasn't supposed to happen. And my dad is a quiet man, but our talk gave me this little poem. 1943. I ask your memory for everything. The price of bread, what classes you took in school, how many bottles the milkman brought to the door. You see your father putting on his stiff army uniform from 1917, while you, his one child, wait carefully in yours the night before leaving. You hear a scratch in the record playing behind you. See your mother sitting so heavily as though she might never stand. The price of bread, you say with wonder, was 9 cents a loaf. I really love history, especially literary history. It's like candy to me. And I love the details of how writing happens. And this spring, I heard a bit of biographical history about Ralph Ellison. I heard that he went into a barn in Vermont and sat down and started writing The Invisible Man, just like that. And I tried really hard to picture myself sitting in a big barn writing a novel. But all I could come up with was myself sitting in a small, leaky boat writing poetry. The bad news is that this is what poetry writing often feels like. But the good news is that I discovered there's beautiful consolation in the boat. So this poem is called Portable Typewriter on a Small Leaky Boat. And it's dedicated to all writers trying to stay afloat. I think it was April that I came here to the Pond House to an open mic, and it was an incredible evening. I think there were 17 readers. It was a night of voices and songs in English and Arabic. And I've thought about it many times since, how all those writers, some of whom are in this room, are out there in the community reading and writing and memorizing poetry. And it's really heartening. So this poem is especially for them. It's lovely to be in such good company on that river of thought. Portable typewriter on a small, leaky boat. This is the way I live, and maybe you too, if you are compelled to write about the water and the overhanging trees. If you keep writing sentences while the shore goes by. Though no one is reading them, I write even more lines. And maybe you too, switching the punctuation around purposefully, like small fish among stones. And maybe you trail your hand behind the boat sometimes, and then write about it, while the actual hand drips and finally dries on the keys. Is this an inexplicable life? The people on the shore live so differently, yet have an old, familiar look. They are waving flags at us, or maybe pages. We can't know, you and I, because the river moves faster even as we write it. And besides, we have only one oar. My husband, who's not a boat person, said, "What does that last line mean?" I didn't say. Ever since my children were born, I have written mostly short poems. And over the years, I've come to, I guess you could call it, embrace this necessity. And now the short poem really is one of my favorite forms. It can give a moment of real clarity. It's a good, deep breath. But there are days when I get a little nostalgic about writing longer poems, and I get this desire to fill up 2 pages and make a poem that kind of travels. One solution I've discovered is to basically stick a lot of short poems together. It's very satisfying, but I've discovered that it really doesn't work. But when it does, I feel like I've gotten away with something. So I've brought only one longer poem tonight, but it's made up of 3 parts that I kind of poetically stapled together because they seem to need each other. And the poem got started when I was wondering if the voices of the dead might carry back to us, but not in a ghoulish way, in a beautiful way, in a communication. And I have to stress that because when my children ask at night if ghosts exist, I tell them emphatically, no, mainly because I like them to go to bed quickly and quietly. And I've learned that bedtime is not the time to allow for any ambiguity or philosophical discussions. But poetry has the space for those beautiful gray areas of ambiguity, and poetry has the time for philosophical discussions. So after a friend's death, it was poetry that helped me consider how far those voices might carry. I think philosophically, I'm not sure if this is a comforting poem or an unsettling one. I'll let you decide. It's called Ghost. In the dull, careless years, when I believed that the separate shouts of the dead and the living remained on each side of the boundary of fire, I couldn't see that the world resists division, that even in this, it is always both wedding and funeral, an invisible procession winding through every street, every life bound tight to the rest and lit even as it is extinguished. And while I stammered and insisted that nothing could be salvaged past death's clean line, the world went right on joining the pieces and playing back every voice, which is to say, making a music that carries. A truth I would have thought absurd if I didn't now hunger for it so fiercely, if my mouth had not acknowledged that it still speaks to you, or that I have heard your voice twice now from the trees, and go there to hunt it down in my own haunted woods. Second, this was your kindness, you who were hardly here, a thought beyond speech, an echo of a gaze. You gave me back to myself, warmer, more human, in a body hinged to earth. Now I know what it is to draw breath, to be in skin, to carry voice through muscle and bone. And the human language, I feel it everywhere in me, easy, tongue and ear, the desire to be understood, fingerprints of word. But now you are leaving. The entire night is outside the walls, and you riding past. And third, it is said that gods may make themselves known in a burning bush, a cloud, or in a shower of light. In this case, it was a blackbird in a bare winter tree. I heard it from a block away, over traffic, through closed windows, as if by a trick of sound. There was a mind in that tree, as wide as anything above, and it spoke. Everything is all right. Everything is all right now. Relief poured in. It was a feast of great peace. Nothing was lost. Everything sought had been found. It was possible to believe anything or believe nothing and yet stand and hear a voice in the air. I spend a lot of time, maybe too much time, trying to figure out what poetry is and what it can do. And I've been writing it for a while now, and it's still very mysterious to me. One of my favorite definitions that I've come across is from Mary Oliver, who said, "Poems are not words after all, but fires for the cold, ropes let down to the lost, something as necessary as bread in the pockets of the hungry." And I love that quote because it's so true. There are certain poems that have become so essential to me. And I think, too, that poetry can be a small but beautiful bell that wakes us up to what's around us, to what we can't quite catch or can't quite see or can't stop for in our daily lives. I know that for myself, usually life is coming at me so fast that it's all I can do to just handle it, put out the fires, have dinner, and go to bed. But poetry has the power to hold me still for a little while, and it keeps reminding me about some of the deeper and more invisible, but just as important things going on. Because I grew up in a quiet family, and because I was the most chatty, inquisitive, relentlessly talking person in the house, when I found poetry, I was amazed, because here was a world of people talking, and they were talking about what mattered to them. You know, love and death, the soul, God and beauty, love, and how to live. And when I found Whitman and Rilke, I just thought I'd died and gone to heaven, because here were real brothers who would tell me the truth of the world as close as they could figure it. And suddenly I felt so much less alone, and I've never gotten over the amazement of it. So I brought 2 poems tonight about poetry. They're 2 thankful poems for this very strange, mysterious art. And the first is called The Second Music. Now I understand that there are 2 melodies playing, one below the other, one easier to hear, the other lower, steady, perhaps more faithful for being less heard, yet always present. When all other things seem lively and real, this one fades. Yet the notes of it touch as gently as fingertips, as the sound of the names laid over each child at birth. I want to stay in that music without striving or cover. If the truth of our lives is what it is playing, the telling is so soft that this mortal time, this irrevocable change, becomes beautiful. I stop and stop again to hear the second music. I hear the children in the yard, a train, then birds. All this is in it and will be gone. I set my ear to it as I would to a heart. And this second poem I've never read before. It's very new. It's called Lantern. And it's the title poem of a book I've been working on. My last book took me 12 years to write. I'm trying to get this one done at least a little bit faster. So I've been working on it for 3 years, and I've been calling it Walled Cities. And I chose that title because I was thinking about all of us as humans and how good we are at putting up walls between ourselves, our minds, our cultures, our countries. And I'd been pretty excited about the title because I kind of stole it from the Roman poet Lucretius, who had this great quote. He said, "When it comes to death, human beings all live in an unwalled city." And it's a fascinating, dark quote. I love it. This is part of my dark side. I always surprise my neighbors by being very cheerful out in the yard and then going inside and writing lots of poems about death. But this spring, I had a sudden surprising change. I had been reading a lot about beauty and the soul, and that reading gave me this poem and changed the direction of the book and me. So with hope, this is a new title and poem. Lantern. Some evening, almost accidentally, you might yet understand that you belong, are meant to be, are sheltered, still foolish, but looking out the door with a contented heart. This is what the king wants, and the old man and woman, and even the busy young, if they knew. And you have it by no grace of your own, standing in the doorway with loose, empty hands. Now your heart lights your mind, a little lantern bobbing within you, giving out not thought or feeling, but confluence, something else. On what do you pour out this light? The wet street is empty, one bird in the yard. Let us redefine love and wreckage, time and weeds. Pour out your lantern light on the grass, on the bird, great and small worlds. Don't go inside for a long, long time. And I'll finish up with a couple more poems. This next one was inspired by an airport chapel. I didn't even know airports had chapels. But last summer, after a 7-hour flight, I was stuck in the Charlotte airport for a 6-hour layover with 2 tired children before the 5-hour flight back home, which are numbers that kind of add up to a desperate total for a parent. I was desperately looking around for a quiet place to sit down with my children because the airport is a very frantic, frenetic place. And so for a while, we stood pressing our faces against the glass of those beautifully quiet private lounges for business travelers and other lucky people. And then we discovered the one free, quiet place in the Charlotte airport, which is the chapel. It's just a little room in a long hall of airport offices, but it was really lovely. It had soft chairs, and all around the walls, it had pictures with quotes. And the one that struck me the most that horribly long day was the one that simply said, "If there is no wind, then row," Japanese proverb. If there is no wind, then row. It was just a beautiful reminder of how to keep going, and it started this poem called Conditions of Happiness. Take a bed in a quiet room and wake without pain. A kingdom is not necessary. Just as one bird proves flight is possible, a crumb of bread establishes sun and wheat, establishes heat, attests to the presence of a loaf and hand. When you do not measure time, each day is a little year. The whole expanse in miniature, every season an occasion for peace. You have what you need is what the birds sing all morning. And the small boat on the river tells us again, if there is no wind, then row. And I found that proverb, that image of rowing, such a helpful thing. Sometimes for tired parenting, sometimes just for getting out of bed. And lately I've tried to apply it to my house, my little falling down 1942 house, my first house. The house in my family did really well for the first 5 or so years of kind of fond neglect. But we're in our 7th year together now, and the winds of change have shifted. We recently realized that the house is very quietly, very mossily falling apart around us, bit by bit. So this next poem is a love poem, both to the house and to my husband. And it's a promise to get moving. It's called House. We should be fixing it, all its parts, siding and shingles, hinges and doors. Between the mold and the moisture, the whole place slides on an entropic edge with a gradual loosening of every nail. We looked away for just a little while, illness, the children, the world, and never noticed the slow lines time was pouring across the ceiling, never saw the one winding like a root down through the floor. Now we lean in the doorway and look. Such work, such need. But for now, you tell me, we should close up, go to bed. The house can rest for now. Since time takes everything equally away, let us lay ourselves down, skin to skin, under this old roof. It will hold. Tonight, let us leave well enough alone. Stars are in the yard. The wet grass is singing. And I'll finish with 2 more poems. This next one is a wish. It's a very small poem, but it's a huge wish, really. It's for peace. And the poem is called just that, Peace. It came with no words. It was a white frame around darkness, the gate to a city deep in my head. It contained hangings and torture, deaths circled by fire. It held also the husk, the green spur, and the strong second leaves. It was a new bird, a field that changed into the sea. I slept long on the ship and arrived. Peace was the shore. It was deep in the world. You were there. We were many. There were no separate stars in that sky. And I'll end with the poem on the broadside, your fan, with many thanks to the Letting Library for the broadside and for this chance to read, and many thanks of you all for coming and bearing this heat. This poem is called The Verge, and it came about because when I lived in northern Vermont a few years back, there was a neighborhood moose out in the country where we lived. And I heard about this moose from the people next door. They swore they had seen it for years, looking into the windows at night. And Vermonters can be very sly with outsiders. But these neighbors told the story of the moose with an awe that was remarkable. And I believed them. And the moose kind of grew in my mind. It grew more beautiful than I ever imagined a moose could be. And I looked for it for 3 years and never saw it. But it did give me this poem called The Verge. Reason is a fine thing, but remember, there are other ways to live, by instinct or passion, or even maybe by revelation. Try it. Come around again to the Verge, that place of about to open, near where we comprehend and laugh and see. You, in your very real life, might be about to take your own foot and step into clear waters that are entirely new. Why shouldn't something marvelous happen to you? Take even an occasion like this. A man reading at night looked up at the window to find a moose looking in, interested and unafraid, with quiet, dark eyes. He reports he has never been the same. He finds the ungainly and miraculous everywhere. He said it started the next night in the empty window as he watched his reflection looking right back through. He said he saw his own beauty, how even in his same old face, the quiet eyes were curious and ready to be true. Thank you.